All right, Assalamu alaikum, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Welcome to another amazing session, Surah Imran. I'm going to keep my introduction really short because I'm so excited just to get back into it. I think just the first session was enough to blow so many of our minds, and I think we just, want to get right back to it. But the very quick thing I just wanted to remind people of, it's December, end of the year. If you need a tax write-off, it's a good time to think about your donations. And I want to remind you about Adopt a Surah, because actually I'm really excited. I think we have about almost 60 surahs. It's 59 surahs that have been adopted out of the 114. We have some really, really good ones. And so please definitely check it out. If you go to our website, there's a link under Project Illumine called Adopt a Surah, and it lists all the ones that have been adopted. But I was looking at what's left, and there are some really amazing ones that we've covered here that are super special. So if you want to extra blessings and get a tax write-off too, check it out. Also, I know that this is a difficult time for converts with the holidays coming up. People are going home, going back to families. So I just wanted to give a shout out, and I know how difficult it is. And I know sometimes people have questions about whether it's okay to, say Merry Christmas or, silly things like that. I mean, I think obviously what we've learned here is just to try and be as beautiful and loving as you can. And if you, are feeling uncomfortable about anything, then just excuse yourself. But I always take these opportunities to just put my best foot forward with my non-Muslim family, because I feel like sometimes my family actually, they're quite Christian, and I always feel like I'm kind of under a microscope. It's like, ooh, what is the Muslim going to do? And maybe that's just silly. Maybe it's just being a convert. But you definitely have so many challenges with family and friends, and I think that it's important just not to lose sight of being as beautiful and patient as possible. And if you feel lonely or you feel hurt or awkward, there's always the comfort of amazing books. And so it's an opportunity also just to say, if you haven't read this book, The Search for Beauty in Islam, I would really highly recommend it, especially as things are slowing down for the holidays. If you like what we do at Usuli, if you like the things that we try to talk a lot about, you'll find so much of it is captured in this book and other books like Reasoning with God, The Great Theft. If you go to the searchforbeauty.org website, you'll find a lot of materials. And of course, the Project Illumine Holocaust, it's a great time to catch up if things are slowing down. So there's so much knowledge that you can immerse yourself in with this time. And I really want to recommend the books because they're out of this world. And so there's nothing like, settling down with a nice hot tea and your favorite comforter. So anyway, but I'm so excited to continue on with Surah Imran, and inshallah, thank you for being with us, and inshallah, looking forward to a great session.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Wa subhanallah al-Ali al-Azim, alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. Wassalatu wassalamu ala Muhammad, خاتم الأنبياء والرسل أجمعين المرسل رحمة للعالمين وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعوا بإحسان إلى يوم الدين. اللهم اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقهوا قولي يا رب. A quick recap. Before we move on, that Surah Al-Imran begins or starts out, of course, after the reminder, the always consistent reminder, Allahu la ilaha illa huwa al-hayyul qayyum. That the center of everything in existence, of all reality, of all truth is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, who is ever living, ever present. Then Surah Al-Imran takes us to a fundamental and basic understanding about the muhkam and mutashabih, as we've talked about. And when dealing with the image of the muhkam and mutashabih, perhaps a useful allegory that Allah reminds us of in Surah Ibrahim is when Allah talks about a kalima tayyibah. And in context of Surah Ibrahim, a kalima tayyibah is the word of truth. And it is in the Quranic language, when you say the word, it is the basis for all of existence. Existence is but a word. Creation is but a word. Reality is but a word. It is a divine word. It is kun, fayakun, be, and so it is. But it is a word. In material terms, secular terms, it's as if the word is energy, the vibration that constitutes energy. But energy and vibration have a source, and the source is the divine word. It is the intentionality, the will of the divine behind the thing. Without the intentionality of the divine, there is no word, and there is no energy, there are no vibrations, there's no existence. So when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about the kalima tayyibah in Surah Ibrahim, the word of truth, and Allah says that الكلمة الطيبة كالشجرة الطيبة أصلها ثابت وفرعها في السماء. So the word, the truthful word, is like a tree with its roots and trunk anchored, and then the branches reach out to the sky. Well, in many ways, the image of the muhkam and mutashabih are like that. And that helps us understand what so many had failed to understand about the muhkam and mutashabih. When Allah describes that al-muhkam hunna ummul kitab, it is like the roots and the trunk. And the mutashabih are all the contextual and circumstantial and constantly evolving and constantly transforming efforts of human beings to reach out for the heavens, like the branches of a tree that reaches out to the sky. So then Ali Imran anchoring us, it is as if Ali Imran is telling us, alerting us to the reality that in the Surah Ali Imran itself, we are going to encounter the phenomena of al-muhkam wal-mutashabih. And indeed, Ali Imran, as it goes on, it will talk about the Battle of Uhud. And there is so much mutashabih about the Battle of Uhud. I mean, if you just delve into the reports about the Battle of Uhud, there is so much nuance that depends on the historical context. But the foundations that Allah lays out before telling us the lesson about the Battle of Uhud is the trunk and the root, the very basis that we can never lose sight of. And after alerting us to this, Ali Imran takes us to a critical construct, if you will, a critical image that is of utmost pertinence for understanding the entire surah of Surah Al-Imran. And that al-fi'atan, the two groups that confront each other in the battlefield. Now, the imagery is two groups confronting in the battlefield. But what Allah is alerting you to, as we will see in the way that Al-Imran itself progresses, is that it is the confrontation between falsehood, between truth and falsehood, between beauty and ugliness, husn and qubh, the confrontation between al-haq wal-batil, the confrontation between what is moral and ethical and what is unethical and immoral. And intuitively, if you are a believer, you know that intuitively. If you start out with that construct that Surah Al-Imran gives you, you will of course want to believe that the group that is with Allah represents the truth, the beautiful, the moral, and the group that is on the other side of godlessness instead of godliness represents the immoral, the ugly, the so on. But Al-Imran then tells you, yeah, but it is not so easy, because the truth that claims to be on Allah's side must fulfill criteria that it cannot fail. Otherwise, its claim that it is the representation of all that we described as good is, to say the least, problematic. And so when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, this is verse 13, قَدْ كَانَ لَكُمْ آيَةٌ فِي فِئَتَيْنِ الْتَقَتَا فِئَةٌ تُقَاتِلُ فِي سَبِيلِ اللَّهِ وَأُخْرَى كَافِرَةٌ يَرَوْنَهُمْ مِثْلَيْهِمْ رَأْيَ الْعَيْنِ. There is in this, there is a very sophisticated reference to how deceptive things can be. Yeah, most commentators, when they read this verse, they said, يَرَوْنَهُمْ مِثْلَيْهِمْ رَأْيَ الْعَيْنِ. So some said that the believers saw that the kuffar were twice the numbers. Some said that the believers, God affected the believers, comforted the believers, so they didn't see the kuffar as much stronger than they are. So in other words, they failed to notice their own weakness. But to be quite honest, I don't think that this is all premised on the fact. This is all premised on that when Allah says فئتين التقتا, that this is a reference to the Battle of Badr. But that's quite that there's no basis for that. There's no basis for saying that this is a reference to the Battle of Badr. If we are understanding the surah thematically, it is a reference to what it is saying. In life, there is a confrontation between the group that is with Allah and the group that is not with Allah. And the question is, what does each group then represent? And when it says that they see them مثليهم, who is it that sees them مثليهم? Well, all commentators said, well, it's talking about, this is al-damir a'id al-muslimin, that this is talking about Muslims seeing them. But again, reread it and reflect on it, and it will come to you. It is talking about the fact of how perceptions itself are so subjective that when you look at the two groups by surface appearance, you can't tell who's on the side of right and who's on the side of wrong. They look identical. It's substance that differentiates. It's an amazing way to alerting us to the superficiality of appearance. It's like saying, well, it's not as easy as the matter of who's raising the banner of La ilaha illallah, or who's going around saying takbir, or who's going around wearing turbans, or whatever. It's not that simple. That's not what tells us who is with Allah and who is against. Consistently, you'll see that the Quran throughout consistently takes you beyond the superficial appearances and says, look again. It's like when Allah tells us to examine the sky, the heavens, and says, you look once, but look again. Look again. Return with your gaze to reflect. Okay, so then, as we said, we start out with, we talked about that there's muhkam and mutashabih. Well, among the muhkam here, as a premise, is that who do you love? Who do you love? Because as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, زُيِّنَ لِلنَّاسِ حُبُّ الشَّهَوَاتِ مِنَ النِّسَاءِ. So, human beings, their tendency is to love sexual partners or sexual desire, children, property, professions, prestige, power. That's what people love. But as Surah Al-Imran tells us, well, that's not the party that can claim to be fighting or representing the side of the godly in this confrontation. The party that is with Allah is clear about its allegiances, and it's clear about its priorities. And it's clear that it's not prestige, it's not the profession, it's not the property, it's not the money, it's not the children, it's not the women, it's not the men. And this is part of Kitab. This is foundational. this is where what the branches will grow out of this. But this is at the heart, at the core. So if you find yourself playing the role of Imam, Mullah, Sheikh, Ayatollah, whatever it is, and it is not the rhetoric, it is not the flags, it is not the takbirs, it is in substance. What is your life about? Are you like the Prophet ﷺ, living on the bare minimum? And as we will see, endlessly forgiving, endlessly detached from this world? Because that's a very demanding thing. I mean, you could be among those who, as we will see, who sit out the battle. But there are consequences to that as well. Okay. Furthermore, Allah alerted us, as we saw last halaqah, that this fi'ah, that tuqatil fi sabilillah, that this party that is with Allah, is described as sabirin, وصادقين وقانتين ومنفقين ومستغفرين في الأسحار, that they are patient and persevering, they don't give up, that they are truthful, they're not deceitful or liars or unreliable or people who cannot be trusted. Qanitin, and we talked about qunut last halaqah. وَمُنْفِقِينَ, and the way they deal with their material possessions is verifiable proof of who they are. They're constantly spending in Allah's way. وَمُسْتَغْفِرِينَ فِي الْأَسْحَارِ بِالْأَسْحَارِ, and when you look at their life, it is full of quiet, private supplication and prayer. Mustaghfirina bil ashar. Bil ashar, it's an image of a person sort of sitting alone, late into the night, at the crack of dawn, supplicating Allah. But even more, the party of God, as Allah, inna dina inda Allah, it tells us, inna dina inda Allah al-Islam, that their gaze is turned towards Allah in surrender. The whole life project is, how do I surrender? How do I rely on Allah completely and fully? But then another part of Kitab, because all of this is part of the Ummahat, part of the foundationals, is the role of al-qiyam bil-qist. That when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that شهد الله أنه لا إله إلا هو والملائكة وأولو العلم قائما بالقسط لا إله إلا هو العزيز الحكيم, that Allah's self bears witness that we can't say what Allah is about because that's beyond us, but our understanding of what Allah fundamentally does is qa'iman bil qist, upholding justice. This anchors everything for us. Because then Allah tells us that that thing we talked about, that those who kill the prophets, وَمَنْ يَأْمُرُونَ النَّاسَ بِالْقِسْطِ, those who advocate or try to uphold justice, those who persecute them cannot be among the party of God. Again, another Kitab, another anchor from which many branches can grow. Okay. And then, before Allah is going to take us to a major movement within the symphony, where Allah will take us to a very wise lesson about the nature of working for God. Allah reminds us that central, you can't get more central than that. قل اللهم مالك الملك تؤتي الملك من تشاء وتنزع الملك ممن تشاء وتعز من تشاء وتذل من تشاء. That in this orienting yourself towards this struggle, it must be very clear in your mind that it is all up to Allah. You do what you do, but it's all up to Allah. And as we said, as Ali Imran will later on tell the Prophet, لَيْسَ لَكَ مِنَ الْأَمْرِ شَيْءٍ. You have no authority, none of the decisions are yours. This is Allah talking to the Prophet. None of the decisions are yours. It is all up to Allah. And another thing that it must be noticed, that this proclamation comes right before Allah says, إن كنتم تحبون الله فاتبعوني. That is Allah telling us that this claim of I love God is unfounded. It is false. Unless it is premised on Allah Malikul Mulk, tu'til mulka man tasha wa tu'izzu man tasha. That unless it is premised on a clear conviction of Allah's role in existence. So to say that you love Allah or to aspire to love Allah, but to gripe about what Allah decides, or to be unhappy with what Allah decides, or to be all the different egotistic ways that human beings implicitly object to Allah's will, which means that they are objecting to the state of affairs because they want things to be different. There is a huge difference between fighting in Allah's cause and doing your utmost best, but the result is Allah's and Allah's alone. Okay. we get to this point, and Allah then takes us back to the narrative of the prophets, which is always the allegorical narrative for communicating a moral lesson. And an affirmation first of Adam and Noah and Ibrahim, but particularly zeroing in on Ali Imran and a set of unfolding events with Ali Imran. So, okay. So, إذ قالت امرأة عمران ربي إني نذرت لك ما في بطني محررا فتقبل مني إنك أنت السميع العليم فلما وضعتها قالت ربي إني وضعتها أنثى والله أعلم بما وضعت وليس الذكر كالأنثى وإني سميتها مريم وإني أعيذها بك وذريتها من الشيطان الرجيم فتقبلها ربها بقبول حسن وأنبتها نباتا حسنا وكفلها زكريا كلما دخل عليها زكريا المحراب وجد عندها رزقا قال يا مريم أنى لك هذا قالت هو من عند الله إن الله يرزق من يشاء بغير حساب. So it takes us to drawing out a scene, a picture, right? That and the picture it sets forth for us is Imra'at Imran, Imran's wife, Hannah, her name is Hannah, the mother of Maryam, right? And of course, Hannah, this is Isa's alayhi salam's grandmother. And so Imran himself is not a prophet. At least we're not told that Imran was a prophet. And according to the Bible, he is not a prophet. Anyway. So Imran and Hannah are advanced in age and or older. Reports. And she longs to give the temple a dedicated, committed servant. And the practice, past then, as I think we've mentioned before, is that you could commit your child to the service of the temple, and the child effectively is raised on the basis of someone who is going to be among the sages bearing the responsibility of serving the temple and serving God. And Khadim al-Rabb, and Maryam, by the way, Maryam, the name Maryam itself in Aramaic means Khadim al-Rabb, or the servant of the Father, the servant of God, the Father. Okay. So, and but she is surprised that what she gives birth to is a woman. And she recognizes that this is a completely different ballgame, because women cannot become rabbis. Women cannot be dedicated servants in the same way that men are. But nevertheless, Hannah and her husband, at least Imran, commit their daughter as a sage. And this, we've talked about this before in Surah Maryam, all the unusualness about this and all that, the complications that this entails. And Imran, while his wife is pregnant in Maryam, dies. So the husband actually dies before Maryam is born. And according to the social practices and Jewish law, actually, back then, because this family is a descendant of not Moses, not from the Moses line of prophets, but his brother Aaron, Akhu Musa, Musa's brother. They have a special status, and the family gets together and talks about, well, now that Maryam is an orphan, who's going to be responsible for the care of this orphan? Who's going to become the primary responsibility is a financial responsibility. And as is consistent with Jewish law at the time, they all, put arrows in a thing, and they pull arrows. And Zechariah is married to Maryam's sister, and Zechariah pulls the arrow that says he will be the one that is responsible for taking care of Maryam, at least financially. But in this dynamic, Ali Imran presents us with another image. Zechariah himself and his wife, Maryam's sister, Hannah's sister, not Maryam's sister. He's married to Maryam's mother's sister, right? So he's married to Maryam's aunt, right? Okay. So they themselves, they're a very pious couple, advanced in age, and they are absolutely surprised to learn that Zechariah and his wife, at this advanced age, becomes pregnant with John, known as John the Baptist in the Bible. And in the Quran, John is called Yahya. يبشرك بيحيى. Remember that Yahya is Nabi and وسيدا وحصورا, and we'll talk in a second about this. So, and in the Bible, John is called Yohanna or Hannah. Both Yahya and Hannah or Yohanna, Hannah, Yohanna, Yahya were all anglicized into John. But it is very interesting that, and I'll comment about why it's interesting, but this sort of details, variances in details are rather interesting. So, Yahya, John, will be the cousin of Jesus from the mother's side, a maternal cousin, right? And now, this imagery in Ali Imran, the way that the Quran portrays it, it's powerful in the emotional constructs it set out. You can practically feel from the language of the Quran the joy and the loneliness and the anxiety of this couple as they become pregnant in Maryam, and then Maryam is born an orphan without a father, and you can literally just feel that Zechariah and his wife are pious and loving people, and that nevertheless they insist on this path that Maryam will be a servant in the temple, or dedicated to serving the temple and serving God. And then Zechariah and Maryam's aunt, when they become pregnant, in John, the joy, the happiness that they're going to have a child this late. And here's the thing. Maryam is extremely pious. Jesus is extremely pious. Well, eventually Maryam becomes pregnant with Jesus. And John is extremely pious. To just jump ahead a little bit, they're also not well off. So Zechariah constantly finds Maryam worshipping in the mihrab. Where is Maryam? She's worshipping. And when Zechariah comes, he finds that there's food. Now, Islamic sources say, taken from a lot of Christian mythology, that the food found, it was food that was miraculously appear before Maryam. And I don't think there's any indication in the Quran or in the Sunnah that we need to believe that this food miraculously. It's not that I exclude miracles. If Allah wanted to do a miracle, it's fine. But I'm talking about the text of the Quran and the Hadith, that when she tells Zechariah, this is what Allah has said, meaning that although Maryam, one would have anticipated a great deal of hostility and persecution towards her as a woman in the temple. In fact, what happens is people's hearts soften towards her, and they bring her food gifts. And it's actually a more resounding lesson that anything that Maryam receives, she attributes the goodness, al-fadl, lillah, that it comes from Allah. I mean, human beings might have brought it, but it's Allah that drives human beings to do what is good, or inspires human beings to do what is good. Okay. Now, at this point, we pause and say, okay, wait. We know that Ali Imran is going to take us to the Battle of Uhud. We know that Ali Imran told us something about Kitab and the Mutashabihat. We know Ali Imran told us something about Hubbullah, loving God. So why is Ali Imran, before doing, or in the context of doing all of that, taking us to the story about Zachariah and his wife, the birth of Maryam, the birth of Jesus, the birth of John? And then these were people battling on Allah's side, battling against the forces of kufr without ever stepping in a battlefield. These were a very different type of soldiers. These were also people deeply anchored in Allah's love. Notice, Al-Imran, mother of Maryam, Maryam herself, the mother of John, Zachariah, none of them loved material things, property and prestige and professions. Their life was centered around loving Allah. But there's even more. And it dawns on you, or it comes to you, when you realize what happens. So, Maryam is born. She is obviously ahead of her age, because according to biblical sources, when she becomes pregnant with Jesus, she's 13 years old and gives birth to Jesus. So she's quite young. But Maryam is not going to live a very long life. She doesn't live long after Jesus. We know what's going to happen to Jesus. And we know what's going to happen to John, to Yahya. What happens to John, to Yahya, is he's going to be executed. What happens to Jesus, and we'll talk about this in a second, but I've talked about it before, whether Jesus is Rafa'ahu Allah means that Jesus was killed, and then but Allah raised him in a way that is beyond our realm of reality. So I mean, you could kill the body, but the spirit is no longer there, and that's quite possible. Or that, as other narratives say, that Jesus said, "Who will take my place?" And one of the disciples of Jesus volunteered, and then as a miracle, and I'll elaborate upon it, as a miracle, God made this person look exactly like Jesus, the volunteer, and that person was crucified. But it's immaterial. But for all practical purposes, if you're living at the time of Jesus, Maryam's father dies before she's born. Maryam herself will not outlive her son very long. Jesus doesn't live very long. John is clearly executed. This looks like a total and complete loss. It looks like a total and complete defeat. But what Ali Imran will tell us, that in fact in this defeat was the victory. And that's precisely why this is laid as a foundation for the Battle of Uhud. You don't know this, but Allah Malikul Mulk, Allah who is the one and only real king, is the one who gives victory or defeat to whomever. You don't know what is a victory and what is a defeat. You think you know. And that is precisely why the story of Zakaria is right there in the heart of Al Imran. Now, you can go search the tafsir for this when you want. You won't find it. But Allah is my witness, that's the truth about Surah Al Imran. There are interesting things in the context here, because فتقبلها ربها بقبول حسن وأنبتها نباتا حسنا وكفلها زكريا كلما دخل عليها زكريا المحراب وجد عندها رزقا قال يا مريم أنى لك هذا قالت هو من عند الله إن الله يرزق من يشاء بغير حساب. This is 37. When Zakaria sees Maryam's piety and her commitment and dedication to Allah, and then he prays to Allah to have a child like Maryam, the sort of the girl that was a surprise and a difficulty for everyone, becomes an inspiration, not just for Zakaria but for humanity, which is mind-blowing, astounding, right? And Allah then Zakaria prays, and Allah answers this prayer and says, well, I'm going to give you John. Now, if these parents would have known that John, while very young, in his 20s, is going to be executed and crucified. John's mother was alive when John is crucified and executed. How did she feel? Could she have imagined what the execution of John the Baptist is going to mean for humanity? Or the whole spectacle of the execution of Jesus is going to mean for the trajectory of humanity in history? Things that we cannot overlook are interesting variances between the Quran and the Bible. So one, you notice that in the Quran, Zakaria says, قال رب اجعل لي آية. This is 41. قال آيتك ألا تكلم الناس 3 أيام إلا رمزا واذكر ربك كثيرا وسبح بالعشي والإبكار. So Zakaria says, you know, what can I do to express my gratitude? And Allah inspires to Zakaria that for 3 days don't talk to human beings, but remain in a state of tasbih. In the Bible, interestingly, you get a very different story. In Luke, it says, "And Zechariah said to the angel, How shall I know this? For I am an old man, and my wife is well advanced in years. And the angel answered and said to him, I am Gabriel, who stands in the presence of God, and was sent to speak to you and bring you these glad tidings. But behold, you will be mute and not be able to speak until the day these things take place, because you did not believe my words, which will be fulfilled in their own time." So in the Quran, 3 days of tasbih. In the Bible, God, it sounds like God makes Zechariah mute until the birth of John as a punishment because Zechariah doubted. And this is consistent, by the way, with the way that generally the Bible is towards a lot of, and it's a carry over from the Old Testament, that there is a constant theme of God punishing, rather than human beings proving their commitment to God through their own volunteering. So those, again, for all the Islamophobic garbage about how these variations are more important than similarities. But there is another rather astounding variation. So we know in the Quran that Maryam she's very young. By our standards in this day and age, she's a child. By their standards, 13 years old was a grown-up. And she's not married. She becomes pregnant in Jesus, and that's the miracle, the virgin birth. But in Matthew, it says, so this is now the birth of Jesus Christ was as follows. This is Matthew chapter 1 verse 18. After his mother Mary was betrothed to Joseph, before they came together, she was found with child of the Holy Spirit. Then Joseph, her husband, being a just man and not wanting to make her a public example, was minded to put her away secretly. But while he thought about these things, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to him in a dream, saying, Joseph, son of David, do not be afraid to take you, Mary, your wife, for that which is conceived in her is of the Holy Spirit. And she will bring forth a son, and you shall call his name Jesus, for he will save his people from their sins. So in Matthew, Mary was married. She was married to a man called Joseph. And according to Matthew, for whatever reason, Joseph and Mary didn't consummate the marriage. But Mary got pregnant with Jesus before the marriage is consummated. Which, of course, I mean, you find this ignored all the time. But And this is the contradiction that you find in the Bible, is this whole thing was Mary, and if she was married, why wasn't, and how could it be that the marriage was not consummated? In the Quran, it's very clear, she's not married. And the virgin birth takes place. these Muslims that get affected by Islamophobia, and you know, one of the big Islamophobic points is, oh, you know, Muslim, the Quran is just copied from the Bible. And that is precisely why then Allah says, this is precisely why Allah says, ذلك من أنباء الغيب نوحيه إليك وما كنت لديهم إذ يلقون أقلامهم أيهم يكفل مريم وما كنت لديهم إذ يختصمون. This is 44. You were not there, and Allah is telling you things that only Allah could have known. And this is if Muslims understood, the author of the Quran was clearly present, so present that corrects minor details in the Bible. Not that whether Mary was married or not is a minor detail, but if the Quran was copied from the Bible, a lot of the mistakes and contradictions that you find in the Bible would be in the Quran. None of them are. So it's remarkable. I mean, these points of coming in and saying no. Zacharias didn't doubt his God and was punished by becoming mute. Zacharias volunteered to do dhikr for 3 days and not talk to human beings. Or completely ignoring the whole thing about, oh, Mary was married, but the marriage was somehow not consummated. You know, it's like, well, everyone knows that marriages at that time were major social events, and you consummated the first night, because among the procedures of marriage in the first night is a demonstration of blood, where, you know, virginal blood, and that's how you prove that you married a virgin, which would be displayed. This is an old Near Eastern custom that in some rural areas still survives, where, you know, the groom throws out or demonstrates or shows the proof of blood as proof of virginity. Okay. And notice just the remarkable image of Maryam and the way that Allah talks about Maryam in the Quran. We saw this in Surah Maryam, but again in Ali Imran, it says, Ya Maryamu, اقنتي لربك واسجدي واركعي مع الراكعين. The same reference to qunut and Allah's relationship with Maryam, it is not about declarations of love. It is about a woman who lives the reality of qunut. Here, in the imagery, it's as if her entire being is one of ruku' and sujood, one of what did it say? You know, a passionate surrender to Allah. Okay. Now, of course, just notice that, as is consistent with the way that the Quran always talks about when Allah educates someone, وَيُعَلِّمُهُ الكِّتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَالتَّوْرَاةَ وَالْإِنْجِيلَ, that is not just that Allah teaches Jesus التوراة والإنجيل, but the constant focus on al-hikmah, which we've talked about, and the impact of that on the Islamic civilization, the idea that wisdom goes hand in hand with an education in the Kutub al-Samawiyah, which obviously, I mean, the impact on the Islamic civilization, especially in the spring of the Islamic civilization was quite young, was quite powerful. Obviously, far more powerful than it is with us today. And the other thing to note is in 49, when there is a description of the performances of Jesus. أخلق لكم من الطين كهيئة الطير فأنفخ فيه فيكون طيرا بإذن الله وأبرئ الأكمى والأبرص وأحيي الموتى بإذن الله, and so on. That giving life to a bird, or healing diseases, or bringing the dead to life. The Muhammad Asad, in his translation and tafsir, understands all of these allegorically. As far as I know, he's the only one that I've read who understood these miracles in an allegorical way. So I forget exactly how he puts it, but that he doesn't understand these as miracles of actually bringing the dead to life, but more like giving face to someone. You can refer to Muhammad Asad, his commentary on 49, if you're interested. I don't have, I don't necessarily share the same impetus to understand these things allegorical. To me, it's in the age of miracles. Miracles were a fact of life. That's what the way that Allah often tried to persuade people of that day and age. And miracles, as we said before, I mean, they're effective with those who witness them, but they lose their power and their momentum beyond that. The only thing is that, of course, there are, among Muslim commentators, they said that in seeing Jesus perform these miracles, it is not surprising that there were, considering the day and age, that there are those who then deified Jesus. And that, because if you're not going to deify Jesus, you have to pay close attention to what he says. And interestingly, what he says actually survives in the Bible that we have today. That he's constantly saying that this is my Father who gives me the power to do this. I am doing this to please my father. I'm doing this by the authority of my father. And then you have to actually pay attention to the fact that he's attributing all the power to his father rather than to himself. If you're not paying attention to the words, then it becomes quite possible to say, well, no, it must be that you yourself, you're partly a deity or you're completely a deity, and so on, so forth. Okay, yeah, I'm just making sure I'm not forgetting anything. On 48, وَيَعَلِّمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ وَالتَّوْرَاةَ وَالْإِنْجِيلَ, Muslim scholars did, every time that you found al-hikmah mentioned, they've written about what that, or explored what that could mean. And among the, of course, and then they often talk about that al-hikmah is, as we said before, the knowledge of what is necessary to fulfill either to fulfill حقوق العباد, to fulfill the rights of people, or to fulfill مصالح العباد, to fulfill what is good for people, and so on and so forth. Ibn Abbas says that the mention of al-hikmah, وَيَعَلِّمُ الْكِتَابَ وَالْحِكْمَةَ, means, al-hikmah means تهذيب الأخلاق, which would translate to good morals or proper morals, proper ethics, something very close to what in this day and age people mean when they talk about virtue ethics. And there is a lot written about that. It's worth flagging, but I'm not going to pause at it because we've talked about it. Okay. The other thing that I probably should flag is 52. Those who are often referred to as the disciples of Jesus, and then who ultimately becomes the writers of the Testament. فلما أحس عيسى منهم الكفر قال من أنصاري إلى الله قال الحواريون. And so in the Quran they're referred to as Hawari. And Hawari is the same word, like from which it's of the same root word that is used, for instance, in Hur al-Ain, in which we've talked about in Jannah. Hawari is as-Safwa wal-Khulasa, are the closest thing or the most pure and intimate thing to a person. That's what is normally referred to as Hawari. Or al-Hawari in Aramaic is al-Nasir, or in Aramaic it's the person who gives you support and victory. So Jesus is met with an incredible amount of opposition. His success is extremely limited in his lifetime because his success is limited to his Ansar, to the Hawari, who are a handful of people. And they are, as in 53 says, that they are commit فَاكْتُبْنَا مَعَ الشَّاهِدِينَ. They commit to bearing witness to the prophecy of Jesus. And as the Quran itself makes clear that Jesus was sent to Bani Israel, to the Israelites, and that the coming of Jesus as a Messiah was foretold in the Bible, and that's, a big subject. Anyway, so ultimately, we get to then 54 and 55. إذ قال الله يا عيسى إني متوفيك ورافعك إلي ومطهرك من الذين كفروا وجعل الذين اتبعوك فوق الذين كفروا إلى يوم القيامة ثم إلي مرجعكم فأحكم بينكم فيما كنتم فيه تختلفون. So Allah, as clear from 55, that Allah then tells Jesus that I will mutawafika, I will how do you translate it? It's not, I will cause your death, or I will, I don't want to say kill you, because it's not kill you, but it's cause your death. And I will then raise you. إني متوفيك ورافعك إلي. This is what generated some of the debate that a lot of modern Muslims are rarely aware of, about that the Quran says Jesus dies and then raised. So some, like Ibn Abbas, said that Jesus asks for volunteers among his disciples, and one of his disciples volunteers to take Jesus' place in the trial and execution that they knew is about to happen. And that God made that disciple look like a replica of Jesus. A minority view that did not survive in the Islamic tradition denied this entire narrative, because this narrative by Ibn Abbas is not cumulative, and it's not of the highest authenticity, and there are some say that Ibn Abbas didn't ever say this, and there's a lot about this. But ultimately, those who said no, in fact Jesus did die, but it's like with martyrs, they're not truly dead, or that's what Allah tells us about them. And that similarly, you think you killed Jesus, you killed the body, but the soul and what Jesus experienced is something completely different. Of course, in modern Islam, if you go and tell any Muslim this, they're completely shocked. What are you talking about? But it was part of the tradition that had not the prevalent narrative, or the narrative that gained the most ground and the most momentum for a variety of reasons, was the narrative that either they grabbed the wrong person who happened to look like Jesus, or the Ibn Abbas type of narrative that God made one of the disciples look like Jesus. But it's interesting that there are in the early Islamic tradition some who had some serious problems in terms of the justice of that narrative. Would it be fair for, and we don't have another prophet where this happens with, where someone would suffer for Jesus, and why God allowed that. And dare I say, because that it was particularly among the Mu'tazili school that raised the most vehement objections to the idea that someone else would have suffered the gruesome way that the Romans performed their executions. Okay. Now, note the continuation of 55. وَجَعَلُوا الَّذِينَ اتَّبَعُوكَ فَوْقَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا إِلَى يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ. That those who follow you will be fawq. Now, fawq could mean higher in moral worth, could also mean victorious. So those who deny you will be lower than those who follow you. Now, of course, you get a lot of discussions in the Islamic tradition about what precisely this means. Does it mean that those who truly followed Jesus, in the sense that those who truly followed Jesus as a prophet, so then it must be understood as a matter of moral worth, or does it mean those who follow Jesus in any form? In other words, that in the future it becomes those who praise and honor the name of Jesus, even if in an exaggerated form deifying Jesus, are far more prevalent than those who had denied Jesus. So you get into these discussions in the Islamic tradition, but the point in this verse, in my opinion, is precisely the theme of Ali Imran. That you go from this very somber, nearly lonely vision of a very humble family that experiences miraculous events that seem very short-lived and seem extremely traumatic at the moment they take place. But who could have imagined? Definitely the people who executed Jesus and the people who executed John couldn't have imagined what these little events taking place in the margins of the Roman Empire in this city of Jerusalem could have meant for the world. And I think, in my view, this is precisely what the Quran is alluding to. And this is underscored in 58. ذَلِكَ نَتْلُوهُ عَلَيْكَ من الآيات والذكر الحكيم. So Allah emphasizes, look, this is the dhikr al-hakim. This is the book of wisdom, inviting you to reflect upon this wisdom. And this is all setting the stage to talk about Uhud. But then affirming the anchoring point that Isa was just like Adam. The fact that he was born without a father is in the same way that Allah created the first human being without a father or mother. Allah created Isa without a father. It is not a thing that should have caused the amount of deviance that it has caused. Okay. Now, we come to 61 because of its... this, if you read 61, the إن أولى الناس بإبراهيم, first 60, let's first do 60, no, let's backtrack to 67. Oh, sorry, what am I saying? I'm getting tired. So, okay. فمن حاجك فيه من بعد ما جاءك من العلم فقل تعالى ندعو أبناءنا وأبناءكم ونساءنا ونساءكم وأنفسنا وأنفسكم ثم نبتهل فنجعل لعنة الله على الكاذبين. This is something known as mubahala. And mubahala was a dreaded procedure in even goes back to pre-Islamic Arabia, because we have reports of al-mubahala even among the people of Mecca. But the narratives that in the Islamic tradition, there's a scholar called Al-Allama Ad-Duwani, and Duwani wrote a treatise on this issue, on the issue of mubahala. And most of the tafsir say that this ayah refers to Wafd Najran, to the delegation from Najran that we talked about. And that the delegation from Najran comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and they listen to what he says about Isa, and they ultimately refuse what the Prophet is saying and say, no, we insist that Isa was the Son of God and a deity. And then the Prophet ﷺ challenged them to mubahala. That the Prophet then said, well, if you really believe this, then, and mubahala is a form of a swearing, a showdown by swearing. So you challenge a person to say, okay, I'm willing to swear that I am saying the absolute truth, and if I am not, I am taking this oath, may Allah smite me or curse me and whoever is joined in this oath. And then the other person either accepts the challenge and makes the same oath and risks incurring God's wrath, or declines to do so if they're not saying the truth. And Duwani writes in great detail in this treatise about when you can do mubahala, what issues you can do mubahala on, what issues you cannot do mubahala, and so on. Interestingly, although you have these narratives that say that the Prophet then invited Wafd Najran to a challenge of mubahala and said, okay, well, I'm willing to take an oath that I'm saying the truth, and if I'm not saying the truth, may Allah curse me and curse my family. That then Wafd Najran declined to accept the mubahala. They said, well, we're not going to take this oath. And they went away. I've looked into the chains of transmission of the reports on the Prophet challenging Wafd Najran to mubahala. And I've looked at what various scholars have said about this. And I agree with the scholars that have raised serious doubts that this ever took place. I mean, if you the Makhtutat al-Diwan, or the treatise of al-Diwani, as far as I know, is still a manuscript. But even if you don't have access to the treatise of al-Diwani, you can read what Razi writes about this. You can read what al-Maturidi writes about this. And they get into some of the prolonged discussions about the authenticity of this tradition, and or not. At least they go over the main points of view or main perspectives. This is, I think, precisely why, because of when Muslim scholars wrote about al-Mubahala, they warned that al-Mubahala is something very serious, because it is taking God's name, and it should never be done lightly. It can only be done about the most grievous and serious of issues. And furthermore, what I find very interesting is that everyone that I've looked at who's written about it says that it can never be a first resort. That it must be preceded by إقامة الحجة والسعي في إزالة الشبهة وتقديم النصح والإنذار. That in other words, you must first do everything to advocate, to teach, to so in other words, it's you just don't use it willy-nilly as I'm just going to go in and start and it's what interests me is actually to say, in light of this Quranic statement about Mubahala, to say, well, it cannot be a first resort, and it must be preceded by advocacy and discussions and arguments and so on, to me is an indication of the civilizational maturity of the interpreters of the Quran in previous centuries. Because I have a very strong feeling that if the Quran was being interpreted anew in this day and age, Muslims would read this and would say, oh, okay, so this is what we should do. After all, it says, فَمَنْ حَجَّكَ مِنْ بَعْدِ, whoever debates with you after Allah has clarified the true story about Jesus and his status, is تعالوا ندعو أبناءنا وأبناءكم. So it seems by the methodology of al-mushbah wa al-muhkam wal-mutashabih that people use. Well, you read this and say, oh, that sounds to me like pretty muhkam. It has a clear meaning. But this is actually a very good example of a non-muhkam, because it is not core. It is not one of the central foundational issues. It is a branch. Okay. And to underscore this, after the Quran mentions al-mubahala, in underscoring that Allah is testifying that this is the absolute truth about Isa. إن هذا لهو القصص الحق. This is the true story about Isa, and this is in 62. But notice in 64. I should say something about 62. I was going to forget it. In the tradition, there is an interesting narrative about 62, verse 62, that people like Abdullah ibn Sayfa, وعدي بن زيد, وحرث ibn Auf, and people like that, that these fellows, they were all Jewish, but it wasn't just Jewish, but there were also some of what we describe as the munafiqun, but these three were Jewish and some others who started doing something very interesting. They would convert to Islam, and then after Uhud, they left Islam and cited a whole set of reasons, among them the results in the Battle of Uhud. But the phenomena, we're going to talk about those who left Islam after the Battle of Uhud a bit later, but the phenomena that is described in the tradition were people like Abdullah ibn Sayfa, who apparently intentionally would convert and then say, after we've become Muslim, we got closer to Muslims and our hearts became full of doubt, and so we left. And they would do this intentionally to sow doubt in the hearts of Muslims. As you know, because of course the natural reaction is that you would go to these people and say, oh, why are you leaving? You know, we used to come to prayer, and why did you stop coming to prayer? And they would say, well, okay, here are all the problems we have. And, you know, of course, some in the tafsir works especially, they say that this is the occasion for a revelation of verse well, it's actually often reported was verse 72, and a minority of reports that says it's everything from 62 to 72. Let's skip ahead for a little bit. Look at 72. وقالت طائفة من أهل الكتاب آمنوا بالذي أنزل على الذين آمنوا وجه النهار واكفروا آخره لعلهم يرجعون. So that some of them said, believe part of the day, and this is allegorical, because it's not that they would believe part of the day and then go back at night. It is that they would believe for days and then go back. Anyway, whether it was an occasion for revelation in 72, it's clear that the Quran is referring to a phenomena, right? But this phenomena seems to have been from the time that the Prophet ﷺ arrived in Medina, that there were people who would intentionally pretend to become Muslim and then leave Islam and then have a diwaniyah, have a major social event where they start telling people why they left Islam. And a couple of things, it's very striking about this, and if we ever do the Seerah halaqas, we could talk about this at much greater length. But notice, I've always been struck by, okay, so these people would become Muslim, and we have reports of a large number who apparently did this, Jews and non-Jews. And then have meetings where they would start talking to people about, you would expect that the response to this would be by force, that Muslims would send in their armed troops to break up the meeting, or that Muslims would send armed troops to break up the meeting and arrest these people, imprison these people, execute these people. But none of that happened. You can't just pass over it. And if we talk, if we do these seerah halaqas, whatever Allah wills, there's much more in terms of details that we can talk about, because the names, and there are many narratives that I would love to share, and many details that you just get left out in all the modern histories that have been written. So that's part of it. The other is, look at the beginning of Surah Al-Imran anchors you in the party that claims to be with God, the party that truly surrenders to Allah Malik al-Mulk, Allah, the true Lord of all. Well, those who are not clear about their faith, they haven't surrendered, will be influenced by nonsense like that. This is like the Muslims of today who get influenced by Islamophobia, or get influenced because of the so-called, former Muslims who form alliances and, take out billboards and say we're proud to have left Islam and so on. SubhanAllah, Allah is alerting you. What is your faith? Is it based on your impressions of the other, or is it based on a genuine, true relationship with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Because if your faith is based on a real relationship with Allah, nothing affects it. Nothing. I mean, it doesn't matter who does what, who says what. You have the true, genuine experience, and that's all that matters. If it is borderline, then yes, you are affected by, this opinion, by this event, by this defeat, by this victory, by this up, this down. You're like a seesaw, you go back and forth. Okay. And notice that after, in 61, the Quran mentions in Mubahala, but it doesn't stop there. This is sort of the sophistication and the nuance of the text. So 64, قل يا أهل الكتاب قل يا أهل الكتاب تعالوا إلى كلمة سواء بيننا وبينكم ألا نعبد إلا الله ولا نشرك به شيئا ولا يتخذ بعضنا بعضا أربابا من دون الله فإن تولوا فقل اشهدوا بأننا مسلمون. So Mubahala is not a divorce. This is what lent Muslims their civilizational sophistication. Mubahala is not a divorce. Even after the Mubahala, there is a point of nuance that you are coming to the people of the book and you are saying, listen, there is a fundamental ethic here, a fundamental, foundational, muhkam principle, is that a human being should not take another human being as arbab, if only Muslims paid attention to just even this one verse, that let's reach, if you say like, let's reach a consensus, let's reach an agreement between us. Let's work it out. On what basis? On the basis that the Father, in the Bible is called the Father. The Father, the Lord. Like Jesus repeatedly says, my Father who is in heavens knows what I don't know. My Father who is in heavens decides what I cannot decide, and so on. That this is the single and one Lord. And that a human being should not take another human being as their Lord. And if they turn away, then say, bear witness that we are Muslim. We are those who've surrendered. As so many commentators have noted, what this clearly means that Muslims do not take one another as arbab. That when it comes to Muslims, Muslims do not treat one another as you are a god or a semi-god or godlike. Again, I've emphasized this in the past, and I'm going to emphasize it again. Reading this text with our modern minds, we easily can overlook how revolutionary this was in the historical context in which it was revealed. I mean, I believe it continues to be revolutionary, because you go to so many countries, even when Muslim countries are replete with the classism and the elitism and the racism of people who completely have ignored this moral lesson. When you go to a country like Egypt and you find the poor referring to the rich as basha, and they talk effusively about someone who's powerful or someone who's rich or someone in the military, or you go to a lot of the Gulf countries and you see the elitism and arrogance by which a Saudi or a Kuwaiti or a Bahraini would treat someone in their employment as if they belong to different races of human beings. Or, this is an absolute moral obliviousness to لا يتخذ بعضنا بعضا أربابا. That we understand the fundament, and when I've said that the morality that in the Quran is the moral basis for the rejection of slavery itself, it's this. Yeah, in some contexts, a slave could be more like a servant. So it's legally defined as a slavery relationship, but substantive. But that is a rare exception, and especially a rare exception as economic and social structures transformed from traditional households where you could have the sons and daughters, and then an army of people that the family takes care of, who are people who've lost their parents in wars, people who lost their parents in journeys, people who no one knows who their parents are. I mean, in some traditional areas, you still find that. There's some places in Egypt, for instance, in the Sa'id, where you find the patriarch of the family literally has, 10 sons and daughters, and then has 30 kids that they've raised who were otherwise would have ended up being the homeless and till today, the status of a lot of these kids are legally, or at least not by the law of the state, because the law of the state slavery was abolished, but they call themselves slaves. And if you tell them, do you want your freedom, till now they say, no, we don't. But modern life, since the Industrial Revolution, has meant that this would be exceedingly the rare exception. And sort of the very institution of slavery is one of master and a subservient person, and an exploitative institution. And when Allah anchors this principle, it is a principle of dignity, and a principle of equality, and a principle of self-perception and perception of the others. And it is not simply a matter of whether you technically call Jesus divine or not divine, but transcends far beyond that. Proof of that, I'll show you. That proof of that is the Prophet ﷺ sitting amongst Muslims who are responsible for not just a battle lost, but for major injuries to the Prophet. The Prophet ﷺ got injured in this battle, and got injured in a way that left permanent marks on his face. Right? I mean, in our modern age, tell me what is going to happen if someone causes you to be injured and leaves a scar on your face. But yet, when the Quran comes and tells the Prophet, وَشَاوِرْهُمْ فِي الْأَمْرِ, consult with them. If that doesn't tell you what does not taking each other as arbab mean in Islam, I don't know what will. It demands, even after the debacle of Uhud, al-mushawara, and demands that the Prophet is not fazl and ghaliz, is not harsh with them. If the Prophet, and I'll tell you the story of Uhud in a bit, I don't know if we'll get to it today, but anyway, that no one would blame him if he became very harsh after the Battle of Uhud, because what unfolded, there are aspects of the story that are truly shocking. An entire moral education. That is the muhkam. That is the muhkam in Al-Imran. The moral anchoring, the moral education. It's saying, pay attention to this entire evolving, this entire lesson from beginning to end. And that's why it's the second longest surah in the Quran. Okay. Of course, then the point that Allah underscores, part of the polemics were not just people pretending to convert to Islam, but parts of the ongoing polemics. And do you see how from the Quran itself you start getting a picture of life in Medina, very different than the way modern seerah books are written. Modern seerah books often read like There is a hijrah, they all come together, they all sing طلع البدر علينا من ثنيات الوداع, and then, Ansar and Muhajirin kiss each other and hug, and then they live happily ever after. Well, the truth is, there were many ups and downs. There were much turbulence. There was a lot of dynamic activity, economic, social, political, at every level. Part is going on is not just those who are pretending to convert to Islam and then go back and then, even compose poetry about why they left Islam. And some of this poetry survived, by the way. But also, Jews and Christians are going around telling Muslims, what, you don't have a right to talk about Ibrahim. Ibrahim is ours. We know who Ibrahim was. Why is this so important? Because notice this house in Mecca or Mecca in old Arabic, the mim and ba were often could be replaced. You could either say mim or ba. Like today, for instance, when modern Arabs say ja or ga. Yeah. So in this house in Mecca or Mecca, well, if, as Muslims say, that this house, and as the Bible sort of alludes to, and we've read that reference, that Ismail and Ibrahim alayhim salam established this house. Well, that house is older than the Temple of Jerusalem. And then it is the original, foundational house of monotheism. And the house in Jerusalem is an affirmation of the monotheism of the house in Mecca. But this, of course, was something that both Christians and Jews understood the connotation of that fully well, and understood that this would anchor Muslims in sort of the original rooted message of monotheism. So they started saying, especially among the Israelites, where we have most of the reports, is that it is Ismail. There was no special relationship between Ibrahim and Ismail. Some of even the poetry seemed to claim that, which was, rather odd, that Ibrahim disowned Ismail. This is some of the poetry that was reported to us from that period. And so by saying so, then the entire Arab line and the entire Mecca line and the entire thing that would say that prophecy is not just in the single line of Ishaq and Ismail would be defeated. And the Quran comes in and sort of engages these polemics. And again, in engaging, in refuting the polemics, you always think of the alternative. The alternative was to flex your muscles and try to solve the problem using swords and prison or beatings or whatever, instead of responding to a point with a counterpoint. And the Quran responds by saying, you think you're entitled to Ibrahim, but Ibrahim was not a Jew, and it's an obvious point. Ibrahim was not a Jew or a Christian. And Ibrahim was Hanif, was in essence, a person who surrendered to God, a Muslim. And so on. إن أولى الناس بإبراهيم الذين اتبعوه وهذا النبي والذين آمنوا والله ولي المؤمنين. This is 68. Notice 69, these little nuances count. ودت طائفة من أهل الكتاب لو يضلونكم وما يضلون إلا أنفسهم وما يشعرون. Notice the Quran, when it often talks about the wrongdoing of others, it is like saying, you know, when they teach you in college, don't overclaim. Don't say, you know, say many people believe or some people believe. What the ta'ifatun, it's like saying some of the people of the book want what? Want to lead you astray. Well, as Razi points out, well, the clear implication of this is that there are others of people who don't want to lead you astray. So be nuanced, be moral. A divine book that doesn't encourage you to make sweeping generalizations. Again, if you read enough historical literature, this would blow your mind, because that takes human beings, the whole, I mean, my God, transformations and revolutions and traumas and, you know, the doctrine of this and the doctrine of that, to develop the nuance of not generalizing. And yet you find it in the Quran, and Muslims often don't notice it. They're so used to it that they don't notice it. Okay. Then we've talked about 72. وقال طائفة من أهل الكتاب آمنوا بالذي أنزل على الذين آمنوا وجه النهار. This is the polemics of that we talked about. Okay. Okay, now let's go. Yeah. So look, 75. ومن أهل الكتاب من إن تأمنه بقنطار يؤديه إليك ومنهم من إن تأمنه بدينار لا يؤديه إليك إلا ما دمت عليه قائما ذلك بأنهم قالوا ليس علينا في الأميين سبيل ويقولون على الله الكذب وهم يعلمون بلى من أوفى بعهده واتقى فإن الله يحب المتقين. And 77 إن الذين يشترون بعهد الله وإيمانهم ثمنا قليلا أولئك لا خلاق لهم في الآخرة ولا يكلمهم الله ولا ينظر إليهم يوم القيامة. This is 77. Okay, so you notice in 75 all of this is unpacking the ethics of this group, الفئة التي تقاتل في سبيل الله, or the فئة that is with Allah against falsehood. Now, and it presents you with another nuance that says, well, there are some of the people of the book who you can trust with something large, a lot of wealth, qintar, a whole large amount. But some of them, even if it is a small amount as a dinar, you can't trust them with it. Now, again, the how unusual it is that you're not telling Muslims, you're not telling Muslims, just don't trust them. You're telling them, well, some of them are trustworthy and some of them are not. But the rational and the nuance here matters, and matters a lot, because it says some of them will not give you back your dinar, that small amount, unless you unrelentingly pursue them. The moral implication is that it is not ethical to fail to give a person their due unless they're after you. So what I've encountered even in legal practice, with some Muslim clients, and I've said in the past that, I've unfortunately developed the habit of telling Muslim clients you have to pay in advance. Constantly calling them and being after them, pay me what you owe me. إِلَّا مَا زِلْتَ عَلَيْهِ قَائِمًا. It's precisely what the Quran describes. So it is the image of what is wrong. But then the other thing is that and again the nuance, not all Ahl Kitab, but what some of the Ahl Kitab said, some opinions in Jewish law said particularly that normal rules of morality don't apply when it comes to those who are different in faith than us. So while normally it is not lawful to cheat or be dishonest with a co-religionist, when it comes to someone who's different in religion than your own, it is halal to defraud them. ليس علينا في الأميين سبيل. That means Ummiyin are people who are of different religion than us. And you say, well, and the Quran comes and, as 76 makes clear, says this is morally, this is wrong. The ahd and the mithaq is the ahd and mithaq. So in other words, you can't say that, well, this is normally haram, but it's okay because it's someone different in faith. Remember, everything said in Ali Imran about Ahli Kitab is also intended as a warning to Muslims. One of the things I learned when I came to the US, among, unfortunately, a lot of my co-religionists, a lot of Muslims that I've encountered in the US, is the belief that it's okay to cheat. I knew a guy who was actually quite quote unquote religious. I mean, he prayed, he talked about God all the time. But he felt completely at liberty to steal phone numbers, which he charged his international calls back home to these phone numbers. And he used to offer me these phone numbers, saying, oh, don't pay for international calls. I'll give you phone numbers that are stolen phone numbers, they just charge them to these phone numbers. And I would tell them, but isn't this haram? I'd say, no, these are kafirs, so, it's okay. I've also had a lot of Muslims who did this with credit cards, and the idea, or I've actually known another guy who wouldn't miss a prayer and, was constantly, had a big mark on his forehead for prayer and everything. But the man had married and divorced 3 women, and each woman he stole her money from her bank account, her car, her, just wiped her clean. And in each one of them, their whole logic was, oh, well, they're not Muslim, so it's okay. It's not. Subhanallah, the Quran clearly condemns this type of morality, this type of double standard, this type of immorality. And somehow the followers of this book, at least the Muslims that I'm talking about, the Muslims I've encountered, and unfortunately it's more widespread than I wanted to believe, somehow end up repeating the same precise sin. Remarkably, the Prophet ﷺ, when he is asked about verse 75 and 76, he said, إن الأمانة تؤدى إلى كل بار وفاجر. When it comes to amana, something you're trusted with, which means, of course, all forms of stealing and cheating, it is absolutely an obligation with every pious and impious person. The impiety or the lack of belief of others can never excuse cheating or lying or stealing. In another hadith, the Prophet ﷺ, again commenting on 75, has been widely reported. It says, ما معناه إن أراد الله أن يهلك عبدا نزع منه الحياء حتى تلقاه مقيتا ممقتا حتى تنزع منه الأمانة فإذا نزعت منه الأمانة لم تلقاه إلا خائنا مخونا. That first, the hadith is much longer than this, but it's sort of paraphrasing the short version. That when Allah is angry at someone, it starts out with al-haya, with a sense of, haya is, a sense of shame or embarrassment about doing what's wrong. And first what goes is you become forward and brash about doing what's wrong. It's like, so what? And to the point that when you meet this person's, their psychology, their very aura changes until you find this person maqita mumqita, a person that has become so brash that it makes you, if you are among those who've turned your gaze towards God and surrender, who makes you feel uncomfortable, sort of eerie. They're disliked and they dislike others. They're hated and they hate others. In other words, this person becomes full of grievances against other human beings. If you sit with them, all they do is whine and complain about other people. In a nutshell, that's what it is. And they don't fill you with peace or tranquility. They fill you with anxiety because they're constantly irritated, annoyed, whatever. And that, then the worst stage, the Prophet ﷺ explains, is that the stage where the sense of honesty about truth and about amana, about trust, is taken away. So you can, now, can this happen while you are praying and fasting and doing? Absolutely it can. If your fasting doesn't penetrate beyond, if your praying doesn't penetrate beyond the movements you make, you can absolutely, that's why it is, ethics is a critical yardstick. You can interrogate yourself about whether you have haya or not. Whether you've become a person who sort of prides themselves on being without shame. You can interrogate yourself as to whether you are full of grievances and you're constantly irritated and annoyed and judgmental about other people. You know, every time you start talking, you complain about other people. And you can interrogate yourself about whether you are a very honest person about your obligations, about your commitments, about what you're trusted with, your job, your everything that people entrust you with. Are you honest? And if you find that you are lacking, then you can recognize that your prayers are not as meaningful as they should be. It's not the other way around. It's not that you start saying, well, you know, are my prayers meaningful? And then let's worry about my ethical character later. It is you examine your ethical character. If your ethical character is lacking, then go back to your ibadah. Because your ibadah has to be lacking. Regardless of what you might think or what people might tell you. I've known people who would pray every prayer in the mosque. Actually, I'm several people, too many people, who pray every prayer in the mosque. Back when I lived in Kuwait, there was a guy who would every salah, even Fajr, in the mosque. But would often not pay his workers their salaries. He would withhold their salaries because he wanted to go on a trip to Cyprus for fun or take his family to Europe. He would not pay his people who work for him 2, 3, 4. In some cases, it went as long as 6 months without prayer. And if anyone complained, they would promptly get them deported. The same guy, if several lawyers that he hired, he drove them crazy for years before he paid what he owed them, and often it was after threats. And in one lawyer, he never did paid. This person would examine his prayer and probably say, I'm fine. You know, I don't miss a prayer in the masjid. But it is his moral, his ethics, his conduct that should inform his assessment of his prayers. It works the other way. this is not a minor point, people, because this is a point so often missed by modern Muslims. In fact, we are not raised to think that way, and that's part of the entire disaster, is that we're not raised to think that way. I want to note that, look at verse 77. إن الذين يشترون بعهد الله وإيمانهم ثمنا قليلا. There is a narrative about 77 that those who take their oath and their commitment with God lightly, is some of the narrative say that this verse was revealed when a man in Medina would often, in buying and selling, he was a wealthy merchant in Medina, he would constantly swear about his merchandise, and that people knew that a lot of times when he's swearing about how much stock he has, he would swear about how much he paid for material that he imported, that he's offering in the market, or swear about the origins of material that he's selling. Oh, this came from India, it could have come from Yemen. He would be lying. And then, as you see in 77, that he's described, or that the judgment about those, that لا يكلمهم الله ولا ينظر إليهم ولا يزكيهم ولهم عذاب أليم, that those people, they're completely shunned by God. And so what's interesting about this narrative is that the reports, there with variations, but anyway, is a Muslim guy that prayed and everything, but yet the Quran comes and says. Now again, I don't believe that this was the occasion for revelation. I believe that later Muslims clearly saw that this ayah applied to this man, and they said so. This man is a clear example of what 77 was talking about. And we do have, in fact, narratives that this man, for instance, was much later than this verse was revealed, that he was around in Medina in the 8th century Hijrah and so on, rather than it being an occasion for revelation. But nevertheless, it is significant that early Muslims of the Sahaba clearly recognized that someone who is swearing up and down about lies and justifying them, that their business needs, is someone who's an example of someone who's going to be completely shunned by God. Although this guy, according to these reports, would pray with them in the mosque, etc., etc. Look at 78. The only thing I need to tell you about 78 is that among the polemics, and again, it's up to Allah whether we'll be able to do the seerah or not, but among the polemics that occurred in Medina was that some of the detractors of the Prophet ﷺ, including especially particular poets from the Jewish tribes in Medina, would compose verses that would mimic and mock the Quran. So يلوون ألسنتهم بالكتاب لتحسبوه من الكتاب وما هو من الكتاب. There are two transmissions about this. Some transmissions said that this is referring to them corrupting their own books, the Injil and Bible, the Injil and Torah. Second opinion said no, it's referring to their mocking the Quran by composing things that sound like the Quran or mimicking the Quran, but it is not the Quran. I tend to side with the second school, that this is not a reference to the corruption of their own books, but either the purposeful attempt at corrupting the Quran or the mocking of the Quran, and which, and again, I mean, it's when you look at the details, what strikes you is the sheer amount of challenges. I mean, you have people that are going around and saying, well, okay, we can compose, why don't we try to compose ayat and circulate them? That, and so that they sound like they're a part of the Quran. And the Prophet ﷺ is repeatedly weeding out, because we have many narratives about this. The Prophet ﷺ is repeatedly, and those who had memorized the Quran in total, which were not all the companions, obviously, but my major function of the Qur'an were to constantly weed out attempts at subversions. That, by the way, that style of either corrupting manuscripts by inserting writing in an already existing manuscript, or tricks where you erase writing and produce new writing on a manuscript, or inventing verses and injecting them into an existing composition, were all devices that were in very wide use in the medieval world, all around the world. In the age before computers and before archives and before, this was a major way that people expressed themselves, yes, in devious ways, yes, in dishonest ways, but nevertheless, it was a major way that you did things. You change the narrative so that the narrative can accommodate whatever your demands are, whatever your desires are, whatever your interests are. And especially among groups that felt disempowered. So one of the major things when you work with manuscripts, and interestingly, the Islamic world got to be quite sophisticated about methodologies in preserving the integrity of manuscripts. But one of the major things you do as an editor of manuscripts, when you work with manuscripts, is figuring out what is the original manuscript and what are corruptions to the manuscript. And the more important the manuscript, so I mean, if it's, this is the 20th surviving copy of Sharh al-Muhtaj by Shirbini, that it's easier, much easier to weed out the corruptions. But if it is one of the two surviving copies of an by Shafi'i, then your job is very different. And figuring out, and sometimes you need to do, use modern science to try to look at ink and, but you'd be surprised. This methodology of you'd be surprised how often this was and how widespread this was. Okay. $79 is, which will, let's make it the last ayah that we deal with today. It's Tuesday night anyway. طيب ما كان لبشر أن يؤتيه الله الكتاب والحكم والنبوة ثم يقول للناس كونوا عبادا لي من دون الله ولكن كونوا ربانيين بما كنتم تعلمون الكتاب وبما كنتم تدرسون. So the first part is clear enough that a reference back, or this constant theme since the story of Zechariah, that a prophet that would not tell people, worship me. But this Quranic expression, كونوا ربانيون, because a great deal of amount, or كونوا ربانيين, sorry, a great deal is written in the Islamic tradition about al-Rabbani. That what a prophet teaches is not to worship me as a messenger, but to be a godly human being. And there is an entire discourse I've published some material on this, about the whole idea of التخلق بخلق الله, the idea that how do you mold your ethics so that you are a godly human being. And for people like Ibn Arabi for instance, or Jilani in his tafsir, says there are people who are aware that their main mission in life is to elevate, to pursue the path of godliness, al-Rabbaniyya, but the essence of being a Rabbani is it never involves a claim of authority of prestige. In fact, Jilani has a very nice passage about how a Rabbani, the more Rabbani you become, the more self-effacing you become, and the more your sense of self-importance is interestingly, there's a hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ is asked about verse 79, and the Prophet comments about something that I always thought, or at least in the report, says that what the Prophet's response has always struck me as very interesting. Because he says when he's asked about this being Abd Rabbani, and then he says, ما من ذكر ولا أنثى حر ولا مملوك إلا لله عليه حق أن يتعلم القرآن ويتفقه في دينه. So what he comments on is, he says there is no human being, male or female, slave or free, except that he has the right to learn the Quran and yatafaqqah, and comes from the word fiqh, right? To learn his or her religion. So this tradition and its variants, it's slight variations, but it's basically the core is always the same, is a right to education, right? And a right to education in the Quran, and which then Muslim commentators, Muslim theologians and jurists have these interesting discussions of, well, does this include the right of literacy? So is it learn the Quran, does it mean to learn it memorization or learn it in literacy? And the vast majority said it includes the right of literacy. Now, if you know something about the history of slavery in the West, you know that one of the big things, especially in the United States, in slavery was that you keep slaves illiterate. Which and by the way, in Roman law, similarly, slaves, it was a capital punishment for a slave to learn, to read or write. An interesting contrast with Islamic law, where actually slaves has a right to literacy. And it originated from this. That's where the genesis of that juristic debate or juristic doctrine comes from. But كونوا عبادا ربانيين, it is not an exaggeration to say that the entire project of the Quran is educating human beings on how to be Abd Rabbani, a godly human being. And when you pose even this, question with an obvious answer, if you have a fi'ah that claims to be with Allah, struggling against those who are not with Allah, is it necessary for that fi'ah التي تقاتل في سبيل الله that it be a fi'ah ربانية, a godly fi'ah? And I think most people, the answer is absolutely, it's necessary that it be a godly fi'ah. And so that then begs the question, of course, all the moral and ethical characteristics that is required of a human being to rise to that level of the claim of, I aspire to be a godly human being. It's a complete paradigm shift, right? Because a godly human being is not petty. A godly human being is not egotistical. A godly human being is not insecure, is not all the character, personality flaws that we would then be invited to fight within ourselves to rise to that standard, or to aspire to that standard. And a godly human being would never claim to be godly. You would never say, yeah, I am godly. It's a contradiction in terms, right? The minute you claim it, you're not. That is the muhkam. See? When the Quran anchors you in this, it's anchoring you in the muhkam, Kitab. And Imran is the entire surah is the unfolding of example after example of the muhkam of Kitab. Okay, let's stop here for tonight. What time is it? Oh, okay. So we are at verse 80.
Okay, Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Oh my God. What do you even say? I think that every time by the end of the session, when you feel like you're completely just submerged, I don't even know what the right word is, but just, burdened in the most, I guess, beautiful and blessed way, because you've just heard even just a portion of the symphony is truly amazing. So just to share some of the highlights as I was taking notes, just for future summary. So as part of the recap, like, who do you love, and are you on basically in the party of God or not? I think the giving us the reason for the story of the family of Imran was just like, mic drop. As you said, that this is not something that you would find in the tafsir, but to understand that you have this group of very deeply pious people, and it looks from basically all measures that they, are defeated. They live a short life, they're extremely pious, very tragic things happen, but that they would never have imagined that this is a victory, because God is the real king, and God gives victory and defeat. And look at, something these small events as you describe them taking place led to something tremendous. I think that the Bible stories are always so powerful, comparing the Quranic versus the biblical, and seeing how God is portrayed as a punisher in the Bible, much more so than, where the Quranic take is human beings have a commitment or given the ability to demonstrate their commitment through their voluntary efforts. That interestingly, that Jesus, the success of Jesus was quite small relative, that it was limited to his companions and a handful of people. And honestly, forgive me for saying this, but I hope that even like the efforts here of learning this Quran, even if it's just a small group of people in Ohio, maybe, like when you hear these stories and you pulling everything together, inshallah, I pray that more people will come to understand and learn from here. And being clear on your relationship with God. What is your faith based on? Is it based on the opinions of other people, or is it based on your real relationship with God? And just the revolutionary nature, again, reminding us of, even though these things we can hear as we're sitting here in a halaqah, to us they're not necessarily that revolutionary, but to remind us of, at the time these messages were coming forward, how revolutionary they are. For example, not surrendering to human beings, and not generalizing, and like the nuance of understanding different types of people, and understating, like some people will be of the type that will not return money unless you stand over them, versus some who will return it right away, and just that lesson, and underscoring that everything that is being covered is a warning to Muslims, and not to take those same paths. So it's very humbling to see that, you know, Muslims unfortunately have not followed that very closely, that it is about ethics and not about ritual or prayer and walking us through the steps of the displeasure or anger of God. So, and the importance of examining your ethical character. So, starting out with a lack of shame or being brash about something that you've done wrong. Then step 2, being full of anxiety or grievances about others, that you're just, you know, the type of personality that likes to sit and complain. And then lastly, losing a sense of honesty about the truth, and that all of that can take place even while you're actively praying and fasting and performing rituals. And I think that even the idea of just all of the challenges that the Prophet faced, when you were highlighting how people were actively trying to change the narrative or insert false verses, and even like the idea that the Prophet had to be weeding out verses that were inserted. I mean, that just is tremendous. I mean, it's like if you think about the Islamophobia of that time, what a tremendous amount of effort and what a battle to just hang on to the message of truth and you know, and I mean, I think it just is such a window into the challenges of today, and you know, challenges that confront truth seekers and advocates of justice again. And then the beautiful end where you talk about this, the more godly you are, the aspiration of godliness, when the more godly people are, the more self-effacing, and how the verse, I didn't write down the number, but you know, how it is a right to education, a right to literacy, especially even among slaves, and the stark difference between how in the Quran you know, slaves had a right to educate themselves, whereas in Roman law it was a capital punishment to be literate. And ultimately that this just leads to educating oneself on how to be a godly human being and all that that entails and implies, and what an incredible paradigm shift that is, and how all of this just brings us back to the Kitab, the heart, the you know, the root and the trunk of the message in Surah Imran. So I know there's so much more, and we're only on verse 80, but alhamdulillah, it's truly wonderful and amazing, and I'm so grateful for all of this. Thank you so much. Thank you for being with us, and inshallah we will look forward to seeing you guys. Oh gosh, it's Tuesday, Saturday, inshallah. So have a wonderful rest of the week, and wonderful to be with you.
Assalamu alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.